What if I told you that one of the most beloved voices of our time, known for holiday hits and tender ballads, died under the warm glow of Christmas lights, yet left behind a legacy full of secrets, betrayals, and deeply buried pain? What if the man who gave us Last Christmas also gave his last breath on Christmas Day, alone, while his family quietly plotted to keep his partner out of the funeral? Would you still call that poetic, or would you start asking harder questions? Welcome to the truth behind George Michael. This isn't just a tribute. This is a re-examination, a case file, a psychological autopsy on a man who was adored by millions, but understood by very few. And if you think you've heard it all, you haven't even scratched the surface. Hi everyone. Thank you for being here. If you're someone who believes that behind every pop culture icon lies a story we weren't meant to see, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This is the place where we don't just tell stories, we dissect them. Let's begin. George Michael died on December 25th, 2016. Peacefully, we were told. At home, in bed, with his lover nearby. But within hours, murmurs began to rise. Not about the cause of death, though, that would also become a question, but about what would happen next. His family, particularly his sisters and close relatives, made their stance painfully clear. Fadi Fawaz, George's partner at the time, was not welcome. He could attend the funeral, sure, but not the wake. And in the months that followed, it became evident just how unwelcome he truly was. Stories leaked that the family had tried to keep him from the ceremony altogether. Meanwhile, Michael's will remain sealed for 3 years. And when it was finally unsealed, it shocked nearly everyone. Fadi Fawaz was entirely omitted. So was Andrew Ridgeley, the man who had co-founded Wham! And helped launch George into stardom. Why? No answers. No explanations. Just silence. Now, why does this matter? Because George Michael wasn't just a singer. He was a battleground. Between fame and authenticity. Between private truth and public persona. And ultimately between love and legacy. He was born Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou, the son of a Cypriot immigrant who ran a London restaurant. A far cry from the sleek pop idol we came to know. From a young age, he dreamed of being famous, and with the help of a high school friend, Andrew Ridgeley, he made that dream real. They created Wham!, a band that was both self-aware and self-parody. The hair, the white jeans, the sugar-coated tunes they played into it all. Critics called them fluff. George called it strategy. But George Michael wasn't a simple teen idol. He was complex and contradictory. At just 17, he wrote Careless Whisper, a song that would haunt him for years. Not because it flopped, it didn't, but because he thought it was emotionally shallow. He admitted later that when he wrote it, he knew nothing about love. And yet, it became one of the most recognizable ballads of the 1980s. That was George in a nutshell, singing about emotions he hadn't yet lived, but destined to feel deeply later on. As Wham! Soared, George Michael was already pulling away, not just artistically, but personally. He knew he had a different identity he hadn't yet shared with the world. And it wasn't just about being gay. It was about control, image, power. His first solo album, Faith, didn't just make him famous, it made him controversial. I Want Your Sex was banned by countless radio stations, condemned by conservative voices, and whispered about in every household. But here's what no one talked about. The woman in the video, Kathy Jung, was Michael's girlfriend at the time. But even then, he knew he was in love with someone else, a man. It wasn't just performance. It was conflict. George wasn't lying, he was surviving. Caught between two worlds. One that adored his artistry, and one that would condemn the truth of who he was. And then, in Brazil, in the middle of a massive concert, George Michael saw a man in the crowd, Anselmo Felipa. And something changed. This was not infatuation. It was seismic. Anselmo became his partner, his emotional anchor. And 6 months later, George would be devastated to learn that Anselmo was HIV positive, a death sentence in the early 90s. And yet, George stayed, quietly, lovingly, without a press release, without applause. Anselmo's death broke him. It wasn't a breakup, it was an obliteration. George would later channel this agony into the heartbreaking song, Jesus to a Child, a quiet elegy to a love lost too soon. But while his heart was breaking, the industry demanded hits. Sony wanted the next big single, the next commercial success. George wanted space, autonomy. So he fought back artistically. In the now legendary video for Freedom 90, George didn't even appear. Instead, he let supermodels like Cindy Crawford and Naomi Campbell mouth his lyrics. Meanwhile, images of his past life, his famous leather jacket, his jukebox were literally blown up on screen. It was artist protest, and it worked. But Sony still held him in contractual chains. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a man torn in every direction. By family, by fans, by lovers, by labels. A man who never stopped giving music, love, philanthropy, but who rarely received the kind of understanding he deserved. And that's just the beginning. In our next chapter, we'll look at the spiral, the arrests, the drugs, the car crash, and the coma. But more importantly, we'll ask why a man so beloved was also so deeply misunderstood. If you stayed with us this far, I invite you to keep digging. The truth is rarely convenient, and it's never clean. But George Michael's story is worth every uncomfortable question we dare to ask. Don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to this channel because the next chapter might just challenge everything you thought you knew. Picking up from where we left off, George Michael had begun to tear away from the machine that built him. His rebellion wasn't loud in the traditional sense. It wasn't some messy, televised meltdown or tabloid scandal. It was quieter, more calculated, more dangerous. Because when an artist starts to reclaim themselves from the forces that shaped them, the pushback is rarely gentle. After the release of Freedom 90, Michael found himself locked in a bitter legal battle with Sony Music. He accused them of treating him like a piece of software, of exploiting his artistry while refusing to grant him creative autonomy. The lawsuit didn't go his way, but it marked a turning point. From that moment, George Michael stopped being a pop puppet. He became a dissident inside the house of pop. But the price of rebellion is steep. And in George's case, it didn't just cost him industry favorite chipped away at his spirit. By the mid-90s, he was emotionally battered, still grieving Anselmo, still estranged from parts of his family, still hiding from public scrutiny. The pressure didn't just simmer, it began to combust. And eventually, it found a release in risky behavior that would redefine how the world saw him. In April of 1998, the headlines exploded. Pop star caught in public restroom sting. George Michael had been arrested in a Beverly Hills park, charged with engaging in a lewd act with an undercover officer. The news traveled fast. Overnight, his sexuality became a global headline, not on his terms, not in celebration, but through humiliation. But here's the part that rarely gets talked about. George didn't hide. He didn't retreat into silence. He stepped forward. He admitted what happened. Then he flipped the narrative on its head. Later that year, he released a single titled Outside, with a music video that openly mocked the sting operation. Dressed as a flamboyant police officer, surrounded by homoerotic imagery, the video was part satire, part protest. It was also his way of saying, If this is how the world wants to define Methan, I'll define myself first. But beneath the cheeky visuals was a deeper, more unsettling question. Why? In 1998, were police still using entrapment tactics to target gay men? Why were undercover officers luring people into situations only to arrest them? And why did society seem more outraged by a man seeking connection than by the systemic abuse of power it revealed? George Michael's arrest was more than a personal scandal. It was a cultural mirror. And depending on where you stood, you either saw a celebrity caught in the act or a broken system exposed for what it was. And yet, even with this surge of visibility, George's inner battles didn't subside. If anything, they became more pronounced. As the 2000s rolled in, so did a darker pattern. Substance use became more frequent. Legal troubles mounted. A 2006 arrest for cannabis possession. Another in 2008. Then, in 2010, the most disturbing episode: Yves crashed his car into a London storefront while under the influence. The world watched. Again, with a mix of fascination and disdain. It's easy to dismiss these moments as celebrity breakdowns. But that's the lazy narrative. What we often forget is that George Michael wasn't spiraling for attention. He was, by all accounts, a deeply sensitive man trying to cope with pain the world refused to acknowledge. The kind of grief that never quite healed. The kind of disillusionment fame doesn't protect you from, in fact. It amplifies it. And while Fringe tried to intervene, most notably Elton John, who repeatedly reached out, George pushed back. He once criticized Elton publicly, saying that what he needed wasn't another celebrity rehab checklist, but space to grieve and heal on his own terms. It's a bitter irony. The same man who had built his career on connection and the emotional resonance of songs like One More Try and Father Figure was becoming increasingly isolated. Not by accident, but by necessity. He didn't trust the media. He didn't trust the industry. And he wasn't sure if he even trusted himself. In 2011, things reached a medical breaking point. While on tour in Austria, George fell gravely ill. What started as a cough turned into full-blown pneumonia. He was rushed to intensive care. For weeks, he was on the brink of death, even slipping into a coma. He later required a tracheotomy to survive. When he finally regained consciousness, something strange had happened. He spoke with a different accent. Doctors diagnosed him with foreign accent syndrome, a rare neurological condition often triggered by brain trauma. It was as surreal as it was symbolic. George Michael had come back to life, speaking like someone else. And perhaps that wasn't entirely unexpected. For years, he had felt like a stranger inside his own skin. A man whose voice had healed others, but couldn't heal himself. A public icon whose private self was scattered across too many roles, too many expectations, too many heartbreaks. Still, he didn't stop giving, even amid the personal chaos. There were quiet moments of extraordinary kindness. Stories would later emerge of George anonymously donating to strangers he saw on TV. One woman was struggling to afford IVF treatment, called the show, and paid for it. Another was a waitress trying to pay nursing school debt that tipped her £5. 000. He volunteered at homeless shelters, begged people not to reveal his identity. This wasn't a PR stunt. There were no cameras, no statements, just George, doing what he could to soften a world that had so often been unkind to him. It raises a question that haunts many of his fans to this day. Why did someone so willing to offer light to others spend so much of his life trapped in the shadows? And that's the paradox of George Michael. He wasn't just a tragic artist or a misunderstood genius. He was a man shaped and scarred by every system he touched. The music industry, the media, the law, even his own fans. Everyone wanted a piece of George. if you wanted the whole man. By the early 2010s, George Michael wasn't just battling his own demon, she was doing it while carrying the weight of an entire culture's contradictions. And it would all come to a quiet, haunting end in 2016. In the next part of this series, we'll turn toward those final years as love for Fadi Fawaz, the family tensions that exploded after his death, and the secrets buried in the will that took 3 years to be revealed. Because even in death, George Michael refused to be simple. He was, until the very end, a man who never stopped defying expectations even when it cost him everything. After surviving illness, heartbreak, public shaming, and the suffocating demands of fame, you might imagine George Michael would have retreated into something resembling peace. But peace was always a borrowed currency in his life, never owned outright. In the years leading up to his death, George entered one of the most mysterious and quietly tense chapters of his life, his relationship with Fadi Fawaz. Fadi wasn't a publicist-approved partner. He wasn't a music industry veteran, or a sanitized version of love that the tabloids could easily digest. He was a hairstylist and photographer, charming, yes, but divisive. And to George's family, he was a threat, not necessarily because of who he was, but because of who they believed he was becoming. The tension between George's family and Fadi wasn't just a typical lovers versus relatives conflict. It reflected something much deeper, a silent battle over legacy, over who truly knew George, who had access to him in his final years, and who would be allowed to shape the narrative after he was gone. And that narrative broke open on December 25th, 2016, when George Michael was found dead in bed, reportedly by Fadi himself. At first, the world mourned with a kind of reverent sorrow. Dying on Christmas Day, the man who sang Last Christmas, leaving this world in poetic symmetry, seemed almost fated. But as the initial shock faded, the questions began. How had he died? Was it drugs? Was it suicide? Why was the cause of death not immediately released? For weeks, rumors swirled. Conspiracy theories multiplied. And Fadi, once a relatively obscure figure, suddenly found himself in a spotlight he hadn't asked for. His every movement was scrutinized, his statements picked apart. Some accused him of being exploitative. Others saw him as the grieving partner left behind. Few saw the full picture. Eventually, official reports confirmed that George died of natural causes, heart and liver complications. No drugs, no foul play, just the human body, worn down by years of emotional and physical strain, finally giving way. But by then, the damage had already begun to calcify. In the months that followed, George Michael's family made a decision that would speak volumes without ever saying a word. They would allow Fadi to attend the funeral, but not the private wake. He could stand at the graveside, but he wouldn't be welcomed into the intimate space of remembrance. Why? That's the question no one wants to answer directly. Whispers emerged suggesting that George's family had never accepted Fadi, that they believed he was more interested in access than affection, that he had isolated George in his final years. But those were just whispers. No one ever went on record. And in the absence of truth, silence becomes its own form of judgment. But the exclusion didn't stop there. Kenny Goss, George's longtime former partner, with whom he had shared more than a decade of his life, was fully embraced by the family. He was invited to both the funeral and the wake. The contrast was clear and intentional, and that set the stage for the next twist. For 3 years, George Michael's will remain sealed from the public, an unusual delay, particularly for someone with such vast assets and global interest. Legal battles stalled its release, and speculation ran wild. Would Fadi receive anything? Would George's musical rights be distributed among his close friends? Would the estate honor his well-documented history of giving to charity? When the will finally surfaced, It was clear George had made decisions that were both specific and enigmatic. His wealth was divided among his sisters, his father, and several close friends from his early career. There were quiet gestures of loyalty to people who had known him before the spotlight hardened, people he had kept close even when the industry turned cold. But there were also glaring omissions. Fadi Fawaz received nothing. Andrew Rijalahi's friend from school, his Wham! Co-founder, the man who had stood beside him when the world first took notice, was also left out. No explanation, no rationale, just silence. And that silence spoke louder than any tabloid headline ever could. Because here's where things get complicated. When someone dies, their estate becomes a legal matter. But their memory? That's up for grabs. And George Michael's memory was now being rewritten by court documents, by family spokespersons, by media narratives that chose which version of George to preserve. Was this erasure intentional? Was it protective? Or was it an attempt to control a story that had always felt uncontrollable? This brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary point. What do we owe the people we love when we're gone? Do we owe them legal recognition? Emotional acknowledgement? A seat at the table? Or just a footnote in history? George Michael's death didn't end his story, it fractured it. Suddenly, everyone had a version, a claim, a wound. And at the center of it all was a man who had spent his entire life negotiating the terms of visibility. Visible as an artist, invisible as a lover, exposed as a headline, hidden as a son. Even the way he gave was invisible. After his death, dozens of stories surfaced from people he had helped secretly, anonymously, without cameras or headlines. IVF treatments, rent payments, medical bills, school tuition. George had done what few celebrities ever gave without expecting credit. He once asked a homeless shelter to keep his volunteer work private. He once tipped a bartender £5, 000, just because she said she wanted to be a nurse. These weren't PR gestures. They were acts of resistance, his way of pushing back against a world that had commodified his name but ignored his heart. And so, in the wake of his passing, when the will omitted familiar names, when the family drew sharp boundaries, when fans debated the legitimacy of those left behind, it forced a question into the open. Was George Michael ever truly allowed to be his full self? Not just the singer, not just the sex symbol, but the man who loved and lost, the man who gave and broke, the man who tried again and again to belong somewhere, even if only in someone's arms. In the next chapter, we'll turn toward that very struggle, the dichotomy between George's public controversies and his private convictions. We'll examine the way media distorted his image, how the public consumed his pain, and why, even now, the full truth of his legacy still remains just out of reach. Because the more we uncover, the more one thing becomes clear: George Michael wasn't just fighting for his place in the world. He was fighting for the right to be complex in a world that demanded simplicity. After surviving illness, heartbreak, public shaming, and the suffocating demands of fame, you might imagine George Michael would have retreated into something resembling peace. But peace was always a borrowed currency, and his life never owned outright. In the years leading up to his death, George entered one of the most mysterious and quietly tense chapters of his life: his relationship with Fadi Fawaz. Fadi wasn't a publicist-approved partner. He wasn't a music industry veteran, or a sanitized version of love that the tabloids could easily digest. He was a hairstylist and photographer, charming, yes, but divisive. And to George's family, he was a threat, not necessarily because of who he was, but because of who they believed he was becoming. The tension between George's family and Fadi wasn't just a typical lovers versus relatives conflict. It reflected something much deeper: a silent battle over legacy, over who truly knew George, who had access to him in his final years, and who would be allowed to shape the narrative after he was gone. And that narrative broke open on December 25th, 2016, when George Michael was found dead in bed, reportedly by Fadi himself. At first, the world mourned with a kind of reverent sorrow. Dying on Christmas Day, the man who sang "Last Christmas," leaving this world in poetic symmetry, seemed almost fated. But as the initial shock faded, the questions began. How had he died? Was it drugs? Was it suicide? Why was the cause of death not immediately released? For weeks, rumors swirled, conspiracy theories multiplied, and Fadi, once a relatively obscure figure, suddenly found himself in a spotlight he hadn't asked for. His every movement was scrutinized, his statements picked apart. Some accused him of being exploitative. Others saw him as the grieving partner left behind. Few saw the full picture. Eventually, official reports confirmed that George died of natural causes, heart and liver complications. No drugs, no foul play, just the human body, worn down by years of emotional and physical strain, finally giving way. But by then, the damage had already begun to calcify. In the months that followed, George Michael's family made a decision that would speak volumes without ever saying a word. They would allow Fadi to attend the funeral, but not the private wake. He could stand at the graveside, but he wouldn't be welcomed into the intimate space of remembrance. Why? That's the question no one wants to answer directly. Whispers emerged suggesting that George's family had never accepted Fadi, that they believed he was more interested in access than affection, that he had isolated George in his final years. But those were just whispers. No one ever went on record. And in the absence of truth, silence becomes its own form of judgment. But the exclusion didn't stop there. Kenny Goss, George's longtime former partner, with whom he had shared more than a decade of his life, was fully embraced by the family. He was invited to both the funeral and the wake. The contrast was clear and intentional, and that set the stage for the next twist. For 3 years, George Michael's will remain sealed from the public, an unusual delay, particularly for someone with such vast assets and global interest. Legal battles stalled its release, and speculation ran wild. Would Fadi receive anything? Would George's musical rights be distributed among his close friends? Would the estate honor his well-documented history of giving to charity? When the will finally surfaced, it was clear George had made decisions that were both specific and enigmatic. His wealth was divided among his sisters, his father, and several close friends from his early career. There were quiet gestures of loyalty to people who had known him before the spotlight hardened, people he had kept close even when the industry turned cold. But there were also glaring omissions. Fadi Fawaz received nothing. Andrew Ridgeley, his friend from school, his Wham co-founder, the man who had stood beside him when the world first took notice, was also left out. No explanation, no rationale, just silence. And that silence spoke louder than any tabloid headline ever could. Because here's where things get complicated. When someone dies, their estate becomes a legal matter, but their memory? That's up for grabs. And George Michael's memory was now being rewritten by court documents, by family spokespersons, by media narratives that chose which version of George to preserve. Was this erasure intentional? Was it protective? Or was it an attempt to control a story that had always felt uncontrollable? This brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary point. What do we owe the people we love when we're gone? Do we owe them legal recognition? Emotional acknowledgement? A seat at the table? Or just a footnote in history? George Michael's death didn't end his story, it fractured it. Suddenly, everyone had a version, a claim, a wound. And at the center of it all was a man who had spent his entire life negotiating the terms of visibility. Visible as an artist, invisible as a lover, Exposed as a headline, hidden as a sun. Even the way he gave was invisible. After his death, dozens of stories surfaced from people he had helped secretly, anonymously, without cameras or headlines. IVF treatments, rent payments, medical bills, school tuition. George had done what few celebrities ever gave without expecting credit. He once asked a homeless shelter to keep his volunteer work private. He once tipped a bartender £5. 000 just because she said she wanted to be a nurse. These weren't PR gestures. They were acts of resistance's way of pushing back against a world that had commodified his name but ignored his heart. And so, in the wake of his passing, when the will omitted familiar names, when the family drew sharp boundaries, when fans debated the legitimacy of those left behind, it forced a question into the open. Was George Michael ever truly allowed to be his full self? Not just the singer, not just the sex symbol, but the man who loved and lost, the man who gave and broke, the man who tried again and again to belong somewhere, even if only in someone's arms. In the next chapter, we'll turn toward that very struggle, the dichotomy between George's public controversies and his private convictions. We'll examine the way media distorted his image, how the public consumed his pain, and why, even now, the full truth of his legacy still remains just out of reach. Because the more we uncover, the more one thing becomes clear: George Michael wasn't just fighting for his place in the world. He was fighting for the right to be complex in a world that demanded simplicity. By now, one thing should be painfully clear: George Michael didn't just live in the spotlight. He survived in it. The difference matters. While many saw a glamorous pop icon with unmatched vocal power and effortless stage presence, behind the flashbulbs and platinum records was a man constantly negotiating his own humanity, often with institutions that had no interest in seeing it. And among the most unforgiving of those institutions, the media. There's a quiet cruelty to the way tabloids operate, especially when it comes to someone like George. He wasn't controversial by nature, he became controversial by resistance. Resistance to expectation, resistance to shame, and resistance to being edited down into a one-dimensional brand. But the press didn't want complexity. They wanted caricature. The tortured pop star, the gay scandal magnate, the once golden boy who fell from grace. That's the headline they wrote. And once they wrote it, they refused to let him live beyond it. At one point, a British tabloid literally stationed photographers outside his house 24 hours a day just in case something newsworthy happened. That's not journalism. That's surveillance. And yet, it was normalized, accepted, even celebrated by those who bought the magazines. What kind of society reduces a human being debate? George Michael never asked for pity, but he did ask for fairness. He once called out the British press directly, accusing them of turning his private struggles into spectacle while ignoring the larger systemic failures around him. When he was arrested in 1998 in a public restroom, the tabloid narrative wasn't about police entrapment, it was about humiliation. The public was encouraged to laugh, not to question why law enforcement was using decoy operations to target closeted men in the first place. When he crashed his car in 2010, the story wasn't about a man clearly struggling with emotional overload, it was about how far he'd fallen. The headlines didn't say George Michael seeks help. They said George Michael jailed again. And when he disappeared from the public eye for long stretches, it wasn't interpreted as rest or healing. It was framed as disgrace, as failure, as shame. But here's what those same headlines often left out: George was still creating, still giving, still trying to piece together a meaningful life outside the noise. They didn't mention the time he checked himself into clinics voluntarily, trying to cut back on marijuana use after publicly admitting he smoked over 20 joints a day. They didn't celebrate the fact that, even while being hounded by paparazzi and plagued by invasive coverage. He continued to produce music that explored vulnerability, trauma, and the fragility of love in a broken world. They certainly didn't focus on how he continued to donate millions to charities quietly, consistently without turning it into a publicity campaign. It's important to stop and ask, what are we rewarding in our culture? Do we uplift artists for their honesty or only when it fits our desired narrative? Do we allow them to grow or do we freeze them in the version of themselves we like best? George Michael was never afraid to show his flaws. He didn't hide from the fact that he used drugs. He didn't pretend his life was tidy. He spoke openly about depression, grief, sexual identity, loss, and loneliness. But when he did, instead of receiving empathy, he often received ridicule. And that points to a broader cultural failing. When male artists show pain, they're expected to turn it into performance soulful lyrics, tearful ballads, dramatic arcs. But when that pain spills into real life, when it leads to erratic behavior, health crises, or visible unraveling, the audience grows uncomfortable. We want our stars to be vulnerable, but only on stage. Off stage, we want them polished, controlled, gratifying to us. George refused to comply. He wore his truth in full view, sometimes messy, sometimes unfiltered, sometimes inconvenient. And in doing so, he exposed the hollowness of a public that loves the sound of authenticity but shrinks from the reality of it. This dissonance became especially painful during the final phase of his life. Even though his health was in decline, and his public appearances became rarer, there were moments of clarity and warmth. He gave interviews where he spoke of finding peace with his past. He hinted at new music. He shared that he was spending time with people he trusted, away from the chaos. And still, the rumors persisted. That he was in hiding. That he was broke. That he was relapsing. That he was finished. Even in retreat, George Michael could not escape the machine that had commodified him. Because once the media decides who you are, they don't revise the story you do, and only at great personal cost. Perhaps the most ironic part is that George never tried to pretend he was a hero. He never claimed moral superiority. He made mistakes, and he owned them. But what made him special wasn't just his voice. It was his insistence on being whole. He was a giver who struggled to receive, a romantic who feared abandonment, a symbol of sexual liberation who had to fight for the right to define that liberation on his own terms. And while the public watched him like a spectacle, what they often missed was that George Michael wasn't fighting fame. He was fighting to keep his soul. In the next section, we'll explore just how far George went to regain ownership of his life and identity, his battle with Sony Music, the creative risks he took to break free from commercial molds, and how he used performance itself as protest. Because for George Michael, artistry wasn't just about sound, it was about sovereignty. And in that fight, every lyric, every lawsuit, and every silence told a story. In the last chapter, we explored how George Michael struggled to exist authentically in a world that seemed more interested in headlines than in humanity. But if there was one battleground where he refused to back down, it was in the music industry itself. And that war, with all its quiet courage and public defiance, wasn't just about contracts. It was about identity. To understand this, we need to go back to the early 1990s, when George Michael stood at the peak of global stardom. His album Faith had shattered records. He wasn't just a household name, he was a cultural force. But instead of riding that wave of fame into safe, predictable territory, George did something few artists in his position dare to do. He pushed back. He felt trapped, not by his fans, but by his label. At the time, George was under contract with Sony Music. And while the world assumed he was living in creative freedom, the truth was very different. He was deeply frustrated by what he called a slave contract, one that gave Sony disproportionate control over how his music was released, marketed, and monetized. Most artists would have kept quiet. After all, the label had made him rich and famous. But George saw something more dangerous than corporate oversight saw erasure. He saw a system that wanted him to produce hits, stay beautiful, and say thank you. A system that viewed his artistry as product, not expression. So he sued them. In 1992, George Michael filed a lawsuit against Sony, accusing the company of restricting his freedom and reducing him to a pop puppet. He claimed they treated him like a piece of software, a tool, not a creator. The case shocked the industry. It wasn't common then and still isn't for A-list artists to publicly challenge their record labels. To many in the business, it was career suicide. To George, it was survival. And while the legal outcome didn't go in his favor, the court ruled against him. The cultural impact was undeniable. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had said, "I'm not your commodity." Even in defeat, he reclaimed a form of control that no contract could truly strip away, the right to his own story. But George didn't stop at the courtroom. He turned protest into performance. His video for Freedom 90 remains one of the most subversive statements ever made by a pop star at the top of his game. The song itself is an anthem of liberation, but the video is what made it unforgettable. George refused to appear in it. Instead, he cast the biggest supermodels of the era: Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, and others to lip-sync the lyrics. Meanwhile, symbols of his former image, the leather jacket from Faith, the jukebox, the guitar, were literally set on fire or blown to pieces. It was a visual metaphor for everything he wanted to destroy: the brand, the mask, the iconography that the industry had built around him. It was George saying, "You don't get to sell the old version of me anymore. I'm burning it down myself." And here's the genius of that moment. In removing himself from the video, he became more visible than ever. It wasn't a disappearance. It was a declaration. He was daring people to see him differently, to stop reducing him to hits and headlines, to understand that freedom, for him, wasn't just a catchy lyric, it was the single most important thing he had left. But of course, the industry didn't welcome this kind of independence. After the lawsuit and the controversy, radio play became more selective. Publicists grew more cautious. George's presence in the U.S. market began to wane, even as his popularity remained strong in the UK and across Europe. This wasn't coincidence. It was quiet retaliation. When an artist bites the hand that feeds, the industry doesn't bite back loudly. It whispers. It closes doors. It tightens the leash around others, making George Michael an example of what happens when you challenge the hierarchy. Still, he didn't yield. He continued releasing music, but on his own terms. Albums like Older and Songs from the Last Century were deeply personal, mature, introspective. They didn't chase radio hits. They spoke to grief, aging, and identity in ways that pop radio didn't know how to market. And in doing so, George reached a different kind of audience. People who were tired of formulas. People who wanted truth more than tempo. People who had grown up with him and were now growing old with him. The irony? While labels were trying to silence his voice, George was learning to use it more powerfully than ever. He stopped touring endlessly. He stopped pretending. He came out publicly. He embraced his sexuality fully, not as a scandal to manage, but as a fact of life to celebrate. And his defiance wasn't angry, it was dignified. When he sang Jesus to a child, you could hear the ache of loss, but also the strength of someone who had survived it. When he recorded You Have Been Loved, you could feel the weight of memory, but also the grace of someone who still had love to give. These weren't chart toppers. They were soul keepers. And through them, George Michael became something far rarer than a pop star. He became an artist. One who didn't just make music but made meaning. One who didn't just build fame but dismantled it. One who understood, long before the industry did, that freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you demand, something you claim, something you protect, even if it means burning the walls down around you. In the final section of this series, we'll look at how George Michael's story continues to evolve even after death, how legacy can be manipulated, how memory is shaped by power, and how the man who gave so much to the world still leaves behind questions we haven't fully asked, let alone answered. Because George Michael may be gone, but the battle he fought for truth, for love, for freedom was never just his alone. We've followed George Michael through the peaks and the valleys, through platinum-selling records, lawsuits, arrests, comas, and quiet acts of generosity hidden from the public eye. But the story doesn't end with his final breath. In many ways, it only becomes more difficult to tell once the man himself is no longer here to correct it. Because when a public figure dies, especially one as enigmatic as George, their legacy becomes a battleground. Who controls the narrative? Who speaks for the dead? Who gets remembered? And who gets erased? George Michael passed away on December 25th, 2016. The timing felt poetic, eerily so. A man who had sung Last Christmas with aching vulnerability died on the very day he had made musically sacred. For many, it felt like the end of an era. But for those closest to him and for the public still reckoning with his contradictions, it was just the beginning of a new kind of confusion. First came the family drama. As previously explored, his partner at the time, Fadi Fawaz, was swiftly and very publicly sidelined. Not just from the wake, but from the narrative entirely. Some believed he was a negative influence. Others saw him as a scapegoat. The truth, as always with George's life, remained somewhere in the murky middle. Then came the will. The document that should have brought clarity only deepened the sense of mystery. No mention of Fadi. No bequest to Andrew Ridgeley, his childhood friend and Wham co-founder. No direct tribute to Anselmo, the man he had mourned in music and in silence. Instead, the bulk of the estate went to his sisters and to a few close friends from his early years, those who had been there before fame changed the air around him. It was a deeply personal will. And yet, by choosing not to explain his omissions, George unintentionally fueled 100 news stories. In the years since, George Michael's name has been kept alive through tribute albums, posthumous releases, memorial concerts, and yet, much of what he stood for still remains glossed over. The industry has repackaged him, a softened, sanitized version of George reduced to a voice, a face, a few hit songs, the edgy, openly defiant, politically sharp, and quietly suffering man behind that voice. He's harder to market. The deeper irony? George himself saw this coming. He once said that fame was a hollow prize, that he feared being remembered only as a scandal or a chorus. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place that's both unsettling and familiar, asking why we keep simplifying the lives of those who refuse to live simply. George Michael was not a cautionary tale. He was a commentary on fame, on queerness, on masculinity, on mental health, on who gets to be visible, and on whose pain we choose to ignore until it becomes impossible to look away. He wasn't a flawless figure, but maybe that's the point. In a culture that often rewards curated perfection, George forced us to confront what it means to be beautifully, vulnerably real. He made mistakes. He sought redemption. He lashed out. He gave quietly. He demanded control. He relapsed. He recovered. He fought for the right to be more than what people expected of him. And through it all, he never stopped creating. He never stopped singing. Even when he withdrew from public life, even when the world speculated and gossiped and twisted his story, he still found ways to connect. Sometimes in song, sometimes in silence, sometimes through the simple, anonymous act of helping a stranger pay their rent. But if we only remember him as a voice frozen in the 80s, or as a headline in the tabloids, then we haven't just failed George. We've failed ourselves. Because artists like him don't just entertain, they reveal. They hold a mirror up to the systems that build and break people. They expose the gap between public adoration and private abandonment. They ask us without ever saying it aloud how much of our love is real and how much is projection. In George's case, the projection ran deep. He was desired as an icon, but dismissed as a man. He was cheered for his talent, but criticized for his truth. He was called brave for coming out, and yet punished every time he tried to live openly. And now, in death, the question still lingers. Have we finally learned to honor the whole person? Not just the parts that made us comfortable? That question doesn't have a tidy answer. But maybe that's what George would have wanted. Not adoration, not erasure, just honesty. So when we listen to his music now and Faith comes on the radio, or when One More Try finds its way into a playlist, let it be more than nostalgia. Let it be remembrance. Let it be recognition of a man who gave everything he had, even when the world took more than it ever returned. George Michael's life was not just outrageous. It was deeply human, messy, magnificent, incomplete, and still teaching us, even now, how to look beyond the stage, the scandals, and the scripts and start listening with empathy instead of expectation. That's the kind of legacy no chart position can measure. That's the story that deserves to last. Sometimes, the most haunting truths are the ones we never fully uncover, only circle around, again and again, hoping the silence will eventually speak. George Michael's life didn't follow a straight line. It curved. It broke. It returned. And it defied. He left behind music that comforted the lonely, actions that helped strangers, and contradictions that still refuse to sit neatly in any box. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some lives aren't meant to be explained theory, meant to be understood. And so, the next time the world rushes to label someone hero, scandal, icon, failure, pause. Ask what story we're choosing to believe, and who benefits from the version we've been sold. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think twice about what we call truth, then subscribe to this channel, because we're not here to repeat headlines. We're here to ask what they left out. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the truths that were never meant to be hidden. We'll see you next time.